One morning, I stepped into my backyard and found the treehouse my son and father built, reduced to splinters. It blocked my view, my neighbor said, as if that made it okay.
I didn't yell.
I didn't fight back. I just turned around and started planning something he never saw coming. Stick around till the end, because I'm going to show you how I used the law to take back our street, without breaking a single rule. After the divorce, I didn't want a fresh start. I just wanted quiet. That was the truth of it. Not healing, not rediscovery, not some poetic new chapter. Just quiet. And for a time, Maple Hollow gave us that. It was the kind of town that didn't show up on postcards, but that was exactly why I chose it. 2 hours from the city, a little nowhere that hadn't been swallowed by strip malls or condos. I found a 2-bedroom rental on the edge of a cul-de-sac, bordered by a line of old sycamores and silence. It had just enough room for my son Jack and me, and a backyard that felt like it belonged to another time. Wild grass, a half-buried tire swing, and one massive oak that must have been older than the town itself. Jack was 9. Quiet, observant. A kid who'd learned early on how to read a room, something no child should have to know. He never asked why we left, never asked about his mother, though I caught him looking at photos when he thought I wasn't watching. Some days, it felt like he was grieving a life he didn't have the words for. And I was grieving too, just differently. Walter moved in 6 months later. My father. He had nowhere else to be, and I had no one else to lean on. It wasn't dramatic. One afternoon, he showed up in a dented pickup truck, a single suitcase, and a box of old tools in the back.
No speeches.
No apologies for old absences. He just nodded and said, "Plenty of room out here." And that was that. Walter was the kind of man who lived more in gestures than in words. He didn't ask about the divorce. He didn't ask about Jack's silence. But he fixed the kitchen drawer that stuck, cleared the gutters before the rain, and sharpened every blade in the garage. Tools, to him, were extensions of thought. Everything had a purpose, a place. His workshop became the sanctuary he never called holy. One Saturday morning in late spring, I found Jack sitting on the back steps, legs swinging over the edge, watching Walter arrange his sockets and wrenches with the focus of a surgeon. Jack looked up at me and asked, "Can we build something?"
Just me and Grandpa.
I remember blinking, not sure if I'd heard him right. Since we'd moved, Jack hadn't shown much interest in anything. He'd play alone sometimes, draw quietly in his room, but nothing stuck. So when he asked that, eyes wide, not desperate, just hopeful, I knew the answer wasn't mine to give. It was Walter's. I turned to my father, who glanced at Jack for a long moment, then said, "Sure. But only if you measure twice." It started as a vague idea, maybe a simple fort, some boards nailed between low branches. But when Walter opened up the old toolbox passed down from his father, and Jack began sketching out shapes on notebook paper, I realized they weren't building something to pass time. They were building a project, a connection.
Something to belong to.
They spent the next week gathering scrap wood and reclaimed lumber from a nearby yard sale. Walter showed Jack how to test for rot, how to hold a square. By the second weekend, they were digging post holes together, boots sunk into mud, laughing about something I didn't quite catch. I watched them from the kitchen window. More often than I'd admit. There was something comforting in the rhythm of it. Walter's steady hammering, Jack's endless questions. They didn't talk much about anything deep. No grand lessons. Just, "Hold this beam," or "Pass me the tape." But it was enough. In the evenings, Jack would come in with sawdust in his hair and dirt under his nails, eyes glowing like he'd just built a kingdom. He'd tell me about the pulley system they were installing, or the paint colors he'd picked out. Red and blue. Like a lookout tower, he said. He started calling it the Watchtower. Made a sign for it and everything. Used one of Walter's old chisels and a discarded board. Etched the letters himself. They hung it proudly at the base of the tree. Nailed in with care and a kind of reverence I hadn't seen from Jack in months. And for the first time since the city, since the split, since the 1,000 little moments that fractured our old life, Jack slept without the light on. It was just a treehouse to anyone else. But to us, it was a marker. A milepost. Proof that maybe, just maybe, something solid could still be built, even after everything else had fallen apart. By the third weekend, the frame was already standing. 4 solid posts sunk deep into the earth. Braced with crossbeams Walter insisted be double-bolted, just in case. Jack measured everything twice, just like he'd been taught, scribbling notes in the same spiral notebook he once used for spelling tests. He didn't just help, he worked. Sweated. Focused. It was the first time I'd seen him fully inhabit a moment without needing to be coaxed into it. And Walter, for all his quiet, seemed changed too. The lines around his eyes softened when Jack asked questions. He never patronized, never rushed. He let Jack drill crooked screws and fix them. Let him learn. He treated him not like a child to protect, but a builder to teach. I watched them share peanut butter sandwiches under the half-built platform, sawdust clinging to their pants. And I swear, for a second, it was like looking through a window into a life I never had with my father. One where we weren't separated by decades of silence and missed birthdays. Where he taught instead of fixed. Where I listened instead of resented. The project consumed their weekends, one layer at a time. Floorboards went in, followed by walls made from mismatched planks Walter had stored for years, just in case. They argued over window placement. Jack wanted 2 in the front for a wider lookout range. Walter insisted on at least 1 on the side for cross-ventilation. They compromised. That was new too. They installed a trapdoor with a rope ladder. Then a short deck with a safety rail Jack was oddly proud of. He painted it red and blue using leftover cans from the hardware store bargain bin. The blue was brighter than sky. The red a little too close to rust, but Jack didn't care. "It looks brave," he said. "Like something you'd want to defend." Walter found an old army-issue flashlight in the garage, alongside a battered pair of binoculars and a pair of walkie-talkies that still sort of worked. They brought everything up to the watchtower and set it in a corner like sacred objects in a shrine. That's what it was becoming. Not just a playhouse, but a sacred space. Jack added details. He brought up 2 folding chairs, a blanket, and even drew a hand-sketched map of the backyard with landmarks like Moss Rock, Spider Town, and Dad's ugly rake. He labeled the treehouse's location as Watchtower Base, Clear View. At some point, he started wearing a red cape around the yard. I never asked why. Every night that week, Jack begged to sleep up there. I put it off, citing weather and safety. But one night, after dinner, Walter pulled me aside and said, "Let him. You can check on him every hour if you need to. But let him sleep in something he helped build." So I did. That night, I helped Jack carry up a pillow and a flashlight. He brought a comic book and the walkie-talkie. "Channel 1, he said, showing me the dial. "I'll check in every hour on the hour." I smiled, not trusting myself to speak. From the kitchen window, I watched his flashlight glow inside the house like a tiny lighthouse. A pulsing reminder that something real existed out there. That childhood, despite everything, hadn't given up on him. I checked on him twice. Once at 10, then again at midnight. Both times he was curled up in his blanket, comic book across his chest. Mouth slightly open in sleep. I left the porch light on just in case. In the morning, he came running in with dirt-streaked cheeks and hair matted from the blanket. "I heard an owl," he said breathlessly, "and something walking in the bushes, but I didn't radio because I knew it wasn't a person." Then he added proudly, "I wasn't scared. Not even once." We didn't make a big deal of it. Didn't throw a party or take a picture for Facebook. But I bought him pancakes that morning, and he ate them in 1 bite per sentence, telling me how a real scout would have stayed awake the whole time. Later that day, Jack nailed the wooden sign he'd made to the base of the tree. He carved it himself, with a shaky hand and uneven letters, but you could still read it plain. The Watchtower. No girls allowed. Except Emma. Walter stood behind him, arms crossed. He didn't smile much, but that day he did.
Just barely.
And I stood back, thinking about all the things I couldn't give Jack. The marriage that collapsed. The mother he missed. The questions I couldn't answer. But here was this thing he built, nail by nail, side by side with the man I used to resent. And it was real. It was solid.
It was joy.
Not loud, not fleeting, but rooted.
Permanent.
Somewhere between the cracked floorboards and the smell of sawdust, my son had found a place in the world. A small one, 10 feet off the ground. But it was his. And that mattered. It happened 3 days after Jack spent the night in the watchtower. The morning started like any other. I got up before the sun, the way I always did, brewing coffee in the half-dark and stepping out onto the porch barefoot. The air was cool, the sky that early morning blue that only lasts a few minutes. I remember thinking how still everything felt, quiet in that way you don't question until you realize what's missing. And then I looked toward the tree. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. I thought maybe my eyes hadn't adjusted or the fog had blurred something.
But no.
It was gone. Not dismantled. Not removed. Gone. As if someone had declared war on it in the middle of the night and left no prisoners behind. Shards of red and blue wood were scattered like shrapnel across the grass. The platform had collapsed into itself, the ladder nowhere in sight. The railings were splintered and crushed. It looked less like a demolition and more like a hurricane had swept through. Except the sky had been clear. No wind. No rain. No storm. Then I saw the base of the oak. Someone had taken a chainsaw to it, cut clean, deep wounds right into the trunk. The bark was raw, wet with sap. They hadn't just destroyed the treehouse. They'd tried to kill the tree it lived in. My mouth went dry. The coffee in my hand went cold. I couldn't move.
Couldn't speak.
My brain hadn't caught up with what I was seeing. Then a voice behind me, casual as small talk. It was unsafe. And it blocked our view. I turned. There he was, Richard Avery. My neighbor. He stood in his driveway like he was admiring his lawn, khakis pressed, collared shirt tucked in without a wrinkle. His wife, Helen, hovered behind him with their tiny white dog peeking out of her arms, eyes blinking in the morning sun. Neither of them looked upset, or guilty, or even remotely uncomfortable. He continued, as if giving a weather report. You should have gotten a permit. That thing was a liability, not to mention an eyesore. He looked at me, expecting something. An apology? A thank you? Maybe just silence. I gave him nothing. I just stared, gripping the coffee mug so tightly I thought it might shatter in my hand. My fingers were trembling, though not from the cold. He didn't wait for a response. Just turned around, walked up the steps, and disappeared into his house like it was any other Monday. I stood there for a long time. I don't know how long. Long enough for the coffee to spill over the side and run down my wrist, long enough for my shadow to shift on the grass. My brain kept replaying the words. Unsafe.
Permit.
Eyesore. It wasn't just vandalism. It was calculated. Surgical. Legal-adjacent destruction. A man like Richard Avery knew the rules well enough to bend them without breaking them. Knew how to act quickly, quietly, with the right shade of deniability. I thought of Jack. Of the way he'd stood beside Walter, tracing the beams with his fingers like he was building a cathedral. Of how proud he'd been when we let him sleep in it. And now it was splinters.
Just like that.
I didn't yell. I didn't call the police. I didn't storm across the street and demand an explanation. Not because I was calm, no, far from it, but because I knew exactly how it would play out. Avery had money. Friends on the local council. If I filed a complaint, it would get buried under codes and ordinances and maybe even a polite letter informing me of non-compliance with township regulations. The house sat close to the property line. He'd claim some of it was on his side, or argue about liability concerns, or say he was protecting his own family from an unpermitted structure. He'd twist the narrative until we became the problem. No one would hold him accountable. Not in this town. Not in a neighborhood where people waved politely but kept their heads down when things got messy. So, I turned around, walked back inside, set my cold mug on the kitchen counter, and stared at the blank wall above the sink like it might offer me an answer. It didn't. Walter was out on his morning walk, and Jack was still asleep. I didn't wake him. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the floor. And then, after a while, I stood up, took my keys, walked out the door. I didn't know exactly where I was going. Not at first. But I had a name in my mind, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who owed me a favor. Someone who knew how to make a statement without saying a word. I drove 2 towns over. And I started planning. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. His name was Tommy Gaines. We used to run in the same circles when we were younger, back when trouble came cheap and consequences showed up late. Tommy wasn't a friend, exactly. But he was loyal, in his own way. I helped him once, years ago, when he needed someone to vouch for him in court. Kept him out of jail, barely. He said he'd owe me for life. I never thought I'd call in that debt. And I never imagined I'd be using it for something like this. When I knocked on the door of his trailer, out past the railroad yard in Riverdale, he didn't ask many questions. Just opened it. Saw my face and muttered, "Well, damn. You look like a man who's ready to burn something." "I need a stink," I said. He blinked. "Excuse me?" "A message. One that doesn't break bones. Just noses." Tommy laughed then, a low, guttural sound that came more from surprise than humor. "I think I got just the thing." He pulled a tarp off the back of his shed and showed me what he called fish emulsion. Basically fermented fish waste, used in landscaping, farming, and apparently revenge. Thick, black, and reeking like rot and sewage had a love child. The smell alone made me gag, and I was just standing nearby. "It doesn't wash out easy," Tommy said. "Lingers. Gets into wood, insulation, even paint. Especially if you let it sit." I took it, along with industrial-grade plastic sheeting, a box of nails, gloves, and an old crowbar. He loaded it into my trunk and patted the back fender like he was sending a soldier to war. "No one deserves this," he added. "Unless they really, really do." That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up in the living room, lights off, watching the Avery house through the window. Jack was asleep in my bed, and Walter hadn't come home yet from his night walk. I don't know where he went on those walks, or what he thought about when he disappeared into the dark with only his coat and a flashlight, but I didn't ask. All I knew was that the house was quiet, and the yard was darker than usual. At around midnight, the lights in the Avery's house finally went out. First the bedroom, then the porch. I waited another hour just to be sure. Then I stood, stretched my legs, and opened the trunk. Everything was still there, heavy, foul, and silent. The kind of tools that didn't make noise until it was too late. I put on the gloves. I moved fast. There's a kind of focus that only shows up when your blood is simmering but your mind is ice. It's like a tunnel. Everything narrows down to action. I didn't feel the cold or the wind, or the cut on my hand from the crowbar. All I felt was precision. I crawled under their porch first, low and tight, but just wide enough. I stapled the plastic sheeting tight to the underside of the beams. Made sure the corners were sealed. Left a slit at the top for the pour. Then I opened the canisters. I can't even describe the smell, not really. It wasn't just fish or rot. It was old anger. It was decomposition. It was every bad memory made flesh. I poured slow, watching it seep into the wood, into the layers beneath the flooring. It soaked like ink into paper. When it was done, I backed out carefully, wiped my hands, and looked up at their front window. And then I left a gift. I took one of the spare wooden planks from the watchtower, one that hadn't been destroyed, and used Jack's same red paint. Same uneven strokes. Same block letters. "We see everything from here." I planted it right in their front lawn, dead center, facing their house like a second judgment. I walked home under a black sky, the stars cold and indifferent. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt done. The next morning, I sat on our porch with a fresh mug of coffee and waited. At exactly 7:34 a.m., Richard Avery stepped outside in his robe. He paused on the top step, squinting toward the grass. He saw the sign first. Then the smell hit. It wasn't subtle. The kind of stench that wraps around your throat and punches the back of your eyes. He staggered backward, nearly dropped his mug, shouted something I couldn't hear. Helen came out seconds later with her dog, gagged immediately, and ran back inside. The dog barked twice, then went quiet. He paced in circles on the lawn, phone to his ear, gesturing wildly toward the porch. No one came to help him. No one stepped outside. This neighborhood didn't like conflict, but it loved watching. 2 days later, a cleaning company showed up in hazmat masks. By the third day, they were tearing up parts of the porch. I heard Richard arguing with the contractor, something about mold, maybe contamination. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. Every night, that week, the lights in their house went off later and later, and the smell stayed. By Friday, the porch was stripped to bare beams. What started as a smell became a full-blown home repair. Contractors came and went in unmarked vans, wearing gloves and masks and expressions that said, "This wasn't in the brochure." Richard Avery paced his driveway like a general losing a war, barking into his phone and pointing at invisible targets. Helen stopped coming outside altogether. Even the little dog disappeared from view.
And still I said nothing.
Jack never mentioned the sign. I had taken it down the morning after, before he could see it. I told myself it was for his sake. That some parts of life, of revenge, didn't belong in a child's field of vision. But it wasn't just for him. Part of me didn't want to see it either. That Sunday, I was wiping down the counters when I saw the cruiser roll up. White, city-issued, clean as a whistle. There were 2 officers, one in uniform, the other plainclothed, mid-40s, the kind of guy who didn't waste time on pleasantries. They walked up the porch steps with the weight of certainty in their stride. I opened the door before they could knock. "Mr. Cooper?" the plainclothes officer asked. I nodded. "We'd like to ask you a few questions. About an incident involving your neighbor." I didn't flinch. "Come in." They stepped into the living room, scanning everything like it was a crime scene. The uniformed one lingered on the bookshelf, the wall of family photos. The plainclothes officer sat down across from me and pulled out his phone. He swiped a few times, then turned the screen toward me. It was a photo, grainy, clearly taken from a distance. But there it was, unmistakable.
Jack's sign.
The one I'd planted in the Avery's yard. "We see everything from here." "Did your son make this?" he asked. I looked at the image, then at the man holding it. I didn't blink. "He made the original. For the Treehouse." "Did he make this one?" the officer asked again, slower this time. I took a breath.
"No."
"He didn't." The man nodded, but he wasn't satisfied. He leaned back. "Mr. Avery claims someone vandalized his property with hazardous materials. Fish emulsion, specifically. He's filed a report. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that?" I didn't answer. Not yes. Not no. Just silence. After a moment, the uniformed officer spoke up, his voice neutral. "No charges have been filed yet. We're just collecting statements." Understood. They stood to leave. The plainclothes officer gave me one last look. "Mr. Avery also mentioned a history of tension. Said you had a structure on the property line. Something about noise. Just so you're aware. If anything else happens, we'll be back. And next time, it may not be a courtesy visit." I nodded again. "Have a good day, officers." They left without further comment. The door clicked shut behind them, and for the first time all week, the silence inside felt heavier than the noise outside. That night, Walter sat on the back steps with a cigarette between his fingers. He hadn't smoked in years. Gave it up after Mom died. But there he was, puffing slow, watching the wind shift the trees. I sat beside him, unsure of what I was supposed to say. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "I know it was you." I didn't respond. He took another drag, exhaled long and quiet. "You think you're helping him, but you're not. That kind of anger, it doesn't just vanish. It stays. Finds a corner to curl up in. Passes itself down." I wanted to argue. To say I was protecting Jack. Standing up for something. But the words didn't come. Because I didn't know if I believed them anymore. Walter flicked the ash off the porch, then looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "You're becoming the kind of man you used to hate." That one landed. I didn't react, not visibly. But the words didn't leave. They just sat there between us, like a third presence we both pretended not to notice. Later that evening, I found Jack in the garage, digging through a pile of leftover boards. He was quiet, focused. "What are you doing, bud?" I asked gently. He looked up, sweat on his brow. "Trying to redraw the frame. Maybe we can build it again, but stronger this time." He showed me a rough sketch, beams, bolts, extra reinforcements. A new lookout post. A second ladder. I wanted to smile. I wanted to cheer him on. But instead, I looked at his face, so earnest, so determined, and I felt something sink. He shouldn't have to rebuild this. Not because someone tore it down. Not because his father couldn't keep him safe. And certainly not because I'd turned into someone who believed that pain was a language children needed to learn early. I put a hand on his shoulder. "We'll build it. But not just stronger. Smarter." He nodded, not fully understanding. But that was okay. Some lessons didn't need to be spoken. They just needed to be lived. It wasn't just us. That truth came quietly, like most important things do, not with a crash or a scream, but in the shape of a swing set. The Jeffersons lived 2 houses down. Retired, kind, always smiling with their eyes. Their grandkids visited on weekends. Twin girls who wore matching overalls and laughed like the world had never been cruel. Jack liked them. They drew chalk cities together on the sidewalk and shared popsicles during heat waves. One Monday morning, I saw Mr. Jefferson standing in his backyard, staring at a mess of wooden beams and tangled plastic chains. Their swing set gone, cut clean through, left in pieces like ours had been. Same method, same precision, same cowardice. "Mrs. Jefferson stood beside him, hands trembling. She wasn't crying loudly, just quietly. The kind of heartbreak that doesn't need sound to break things open. And that was the moment. The moment I realized this wasn't just about Jack's treehouse. This was about control. Richard Avery didn't just destroy what we built. He wanted to control what other people were allowed to build. What they could enjoy. What joy they could express in plain sight.
No noise. No color.
No laughter that lasted past sunset. He wanted the whole street to operate on his terms. I didn't say anything at first. Just stood by the edge of my yard, watching as Mr. Jefferson tried to lift a broken support beam on his own. His hands were shaking. His back hunched from years. Not hours. But he didn't stop. I walked over without thinking. "Let me help." We carried the wood to the shed together, in silence. Halfway through, he muttered. He said we should have asked permission. I paused. "For a swing set?" He nodded. Said it cluttered the view. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood. That night, I made phone calls. 7 neighbors came to my house, some alone, some with kids. We sat in the living room and on the floor, surrounded by mugs of tea, boxes of tissues, and years of unspoken frustration. The single mom from across the street told us how her dog barked once too often, and within the week, she received a noise complaint and a city fine. The young couple at the end of the cul-de-sac had painted their shutters yellow, cheerful, sunny, and got an anonymous note saying they were bringing down property value. One family received a letter claiming their inflatable pool was an environmental hazard. Each story was different, but the root was the same. Richard Avery. Every time, he kept it just legal. Filed things the right way, called the right departments. Stayed polite on paper, venomous in person. He operated like mold, quiet, invasive, and hard to get rid of without tearing up the whole wall. No one had stood up to him, not because they agreed, but because no one wanted to be the next target. Until now. We didn't plan a protest. No pitchforks, no angry maps. We weren't that kind of people. But we were tired. So we started small. Sidewalk chalk appeared on every driveway. Smiling suns, rocket ships, hopscotch grids in neon pink. Someone bought a drum set and played it every evening in their open garage. Not well, but loud enough. Another family put up string lights across their fence and invited kids over for backyard games. Jack was invited to paint rocks with the Jefferson girls. He made one that said, in red crayon-like letters, "Fun lives here." And me? I rebuilt the watchtower. Not the same one. Bigger. Taller. With floodlights triggered by motion sensors. Every time someone walked past our backyard after dark, the tree lit up like a lighthouse guarding a coastline. Walter helped, though he said little. He ran the power line from the shed and mounted the lights, checking each angle like a craftsman installing cathedral glass. Jack stood beside us, not asking whether he was allowed, just knowing that he was. The new sign read, "The Watchtower 2.0, we see joy." I saw Avery watching from his window one afternoon. Just watching. He didn't come outside. Not yet. A week later, I found him in my yard at 2:17 a.m., dressed in black, bolt cutters in hand. He hadn't seen the second camera, mounted behind the shed, just above the motion light. When it lit up, and the yard went bright as noon, he froze like a child caught sneaking cookies. I stepped outside without shoes, without shouting, just walked until he turned and saw me. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked. He opened his mouth to speak, but I didn't let him. "You take one more step, I call the police. You take two, and I file a restraining order of my own." He stammered something about hazardous structures and property safety. I raised my hand.
No.
Not this time. He looked like he might argue, but he didn't. He dropped the bolt cutters and walked away. The next morning, I filed a report.
I didn't want to.
But I did. Because it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who thought they didn't have the right to enjoy their own home. That day, for the first time since we moved in, neighbors waved at each other in broad daylight. Kids ran across yards without checking over their shoulders. Chalk drawings crossed property lines. The street was waking up. And once it did, there was no going back. 3 days after I filed the report, I got a knock on my door. It wasn't the police this time. It was a man in a suit, holding a folded piece of paper and wearing the same polite neutrality as a bank teller. He introduced himself as a process server and handed me the document with a nod. "Mr. Avery has filed for a temporary restraining order," he said. "You'll find the court date and restrictions inside. Please don't attempt contact." I stood there, barefoot, holding the paper like it was written in a different language. The man didn't wait for a response. Just turned and walked down the steps like he'd done this 100 times. I closed the door and opened the envelope. The language was clear, clinical. Avery alleged that I had engaged in a pattern of harassment, including targeted symbolic threats and intentional disruption of property value and personal safety. He listed the sign, the lights on the treehouse, the increased neighborhood noise, even my leadership role in coordinated group behavior. He called it psychological warfare. He said the spotlight from the watchtower was directed harassment. The judge granted the temporary order. It stated that I could not come within 100 feet of Avery's property, including the dividing line between our yards. Which meant one thing. Jack couldn't use the treehouse anymore, because it now technically stood within the restricted zone. I read the paragraph again, slowly, as if doing so might change the math. It didn't. The watchtower, the very symbol of his healing, of our healing, off limits. Jack didn't say much when I told him, just nodded. Later, I found him sitting under the tree, staring up at the platform like it was a museum exhibit he couldn't touch. He had his backpack on and one of the walkie-talkies in his hand, still set to channel 1. "Can't we just move it?" he asked, voice small. I shook my head. It wouldn't be the same. He nodded again. "Okay." But it wasn't okay. That night, I sat in the garage for hours, surrounded by blueprints, scrap wood, tools. I wasn't building anything. I wasn't fixing anything. I was just trying to think of a way forward that didn't require destruction. Walter came in around midnight. He didn't say a word at first. Just stood in the doorway, arms crossed, like he was weighing something heavy. Finally, he spoke. "If you want to beat a man like that," he said quietly, "you don't fight with your fists." I looked up. "You bleed him slow," he continued. "The way he's bled this neighborhood for years." I didn't respond.
But something inside me shifted. He was right.
Avery had been winning because he understood how to twist the rules into weapons. He didn't break them. He bent them, Just enough to hurt, not enough to get caught. And if I wanted to stop him, I'd have to do the same. But in the opposite direction. Not with malice. With precision. So I started collecting paper. I went to the township building and filed a public records request. It took less than a week to get copies of every permit, inspection, and property plan Avery had filed over the last 10 years. I spent late nights reading through city codes, measuring fence distances, comparing elevation maps to blueprint sketches. And I found cracks. A retaining wall built without an inspection signature. A patio extension that exceeded the legal setback by 3 feet. A fence erected on a public easement. A downspout that violated runoff drainage codes. Individually, nothing major. But together, it was enough.
I drafted anonymous tips.
I attached photos. I sent them to zoning, to building inspection, to code enforcement. Not all at once. Just one at a time. A slow leak. Meanwhile, the neighborhood kept buzzing. The Jeffersons hosted a weekly porch concert with ukuleles and tambourines. The single mom hosted a sidewalk chalk contest. Someone spray-painted a mural on their backyard shed. Joy is resistance. And though no one said it out loud, every kid on the block seemed to end up playing under the watchtower. Even if they never climbed it. It wasn't just a treehouse anymore. It was a message. Avery's windows stayed shut. His porch stayed empty. And when city officials showed up, first a code officer, then a building inspector, he stood on his lawn red-faced and shouting. I didn't wave, didn't gloat. I just watched from my porch, coffee in hand, camera rolling behind me, quiet, lawful, and ready. The man who tried to control a street with fear was now drowning in paperwork. And I didn't lift a finger. Not directly. It should have felt like a victory. The inspectors kept coming. Every week. A new citation. One for the retaining wall. Another for the illegal patio extension. One morning, a notice went up on Avery's door. Final warning. Corrective action required. I watched him stand on the lawn, fists clenched, sweat soaking the collar of his pressed shirt as he argued with a man holding a clipboard and no sympathy. He paced like a dog that had forgotten where the fence ended. Helen hadn't been seen in days. But still, something felt off. Jack barely smiled anymore. Not because of Avery, he was no longer afraid of him, but because of the watchtower. It stood empty now, sun-bleached and silent, like a ghost of joy past. The structure was still sound, the paint still bold, but the heart of it had gone quiet. And I didn't know how to bring it back. One night, after dinner, Jack stood in the hallway with one of the walkie-talkies in his hand. He didn't say anything, just clicked it on, waited a moment, then clicked it back off. Channel 1.
Still his.
I miss it, he said finally. I know. He looked up at me, blinking slow. Is he leaving because of us? I paused. There it was. The question I'd been afraid of. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I did. Yes, I said slowly. But not just because of us. Because of a lot of things.
Choices he made.
The way he treated people. You didn't do anything wrong. Jack nodded, but there was no comfort in it. Only resignation. I didn't want to win, he whispered. I just wanted to play. I couldn't breathe for a second. His words hit harder than any complaint, any insult. They pierced through all the tactical satisfaction I'd built up, all the justification I'd crafted. I just wanted to play. That night, I sat outside long after Jack had gone to bed. Walter joined me, his footsteps heavy with age and understanding. You ever think we went too far? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Just lit a cigarette, took a slow drag, and stared out at the tree. Then he said, You know the difference between winning and surviving? I looked at him.
No.
Winning feels like relief. Surviving feels like silence. I didn't fully understand what he meant, not then. But I carried the words with me. A week later, Helen Avery packed a car. I saw her in the early morning light, suitcase in hand, her dog in the front seat. She didn't cry, didn't slam doors. She just loaded her things, sat behind the wheel, and drove away without a glance back. Richard stood on the porch as she left. Didn't wave.
Didn't follow.
Just stood there, stiff and still. As if letting her go was the only move he had left that didn't end in collapse. The neighborhood didn't say anything.
No gossip. No judgment.
Just silence. A few days after that, the for sale sign went up. Jack saw it before I did. He was sitting on the porch steps, sketchbook in his lap. When I came out with coffee, he didn't look up. Is it over? He asked. I sat beside him. I don't know. He turned the page of his sketchbook. A drawing of the watchtower. But different, brighter, taller, surrounded by trees filled with lights and ladders and flags. You think I'll always remember this? He asked. I swallowed hard. I think you'll remember how it felt. He nodded again, thoughtful, distant. Then he said, I hope I don't become like him. That one stung. You won't, I said, because you already know better. But inside, I wasn't sure if I was talking to him or to myself. Because here's the thing about revenge, even the quiet kind, even the legal kind, it leaves something behind. Not always guilt, but a kind of weariness. A shadow that stretches longer than you expect. The watchtower still stood, but it didn't glow the way it once had. Not for Jack. Not for me. It had become something else now. A monument. A warning. A memory. And I wondered, how long would it take before it became a symbol of healing again? Before it stopped being about Avery? And started being about Jack? I used to think justice came in one shape. Loud. Final. Cinematic. Turns out, sometimes justice is paperwork. After Helen left, the lights in Avery's house stayed on longer. He stopped shaving. Stopped pretending. He walked like a man who'd lost the script but couldn't admit it. And every time I saw him, something inside me wavered. Not pity. Not forgiveness. Just fatigue. But Walter's words echoed. You bleed him slow. And I had bled. Quietly.
Carefully.
But now it was time to let the system finish the work. I submitted the final tip anonymously, complete with photos, timestamp diagrams, and supporting language lifted directly from the township's zoning code. The complaint? That his new fence, installed 3 years ago, encroached on public easement by 18 inches. It blocked access for service lines and foot traffic. Technically, a violation. Small?
Yes.
But cumulative? Lethal. Over the next few weeks, Avery received 3 more notices. His fine total climbed past $8,000. A hearing was scheduled with the zoning board. He filed appeals. They were denied. The township had grown tired of him. Or maybe, finally, someone in the office had listened to the neighborhood's whispers. Because we weren't silent anymore. The single mom down the street hosted a block party. Not just a backyard gathering, an actual event, with flyers and decorations and lemonade stands. She filed for a street permit. Got it approved. When the police came, it was to direct traffic, not to shut things down. Jack helped run the chalk station. He didn't talk much about the watchtower anymore. But every so often, I'd catch him glancing toward it, like someone looking at an old scar, wondering if it still hurt. The Jeffersons hung wind chimes in their tree. When the wind blew, it sounded like a symphony of small freedoms. One house painted their garage door rainbow. Another family put up a basketball hoop in the street. It wasn't a rebellion. It was reclamation. And in the middle of it, Avery unraveled. I saw him one morning, standing in his yard, staring across the street at a little boy drawing stars in sidewalk chalk. He didn't say anything, just watched, like he was waiting for a mistake that never came. The man who once controlled everything through whispers now had to live with the sound of joy. And that, I realized, was the true cost of what he'd done. He hadn't just tried to silence children. He taught them what fear looked like. And now they knew how to name it, and how to stand up to it. One afternoon, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a letter from the zoning board, confirming that the complaint had been upheld. Avery would be required to remove the fence, apply for a variance hearing, or face further fines and possible civil enforcement. The letter didn't bring satisfaction, but it brought finality. I walked outside, stood at the base of the watchtower, and looked up. It had weathered storms, real and metaphorical. And it still stood. That meant something. That weekend, I pulled the extension ladder out of the garage and climbed up to the platform. The paint was fading. A few nails had rusted, but the view was the same. Jack joined me halfway through the repairs.
He didn't ask.
He just brought a tool belt that Walter had adjusted to fit him and sat down next to me. "Can we put the flag back up?" he asked. I looked at him. "I think it's time."
So we did.
A scrap of red cloth Jack had saved from the first version. It was frayed at the edges but still bold. We stapled it to the wooden pole, and when the wind picked up, it snapped like a promise. Later that evening, Walter grilled burgers in the backyard while the kids from next door took turns climbing the watchtower ladder. No one asked permission. No one needed to. And for the first time in a long time, the lights that glowed from the tree weren't a warning. They were welcome. Avery stayed inside. His for sale sign remained untouched. He didn't make eye contact anymore. Didn't send letters. Didn't file reports. His world had gotten smaller.
Ours had grown.
That night, as the last of the kids went home and the sky faded into its softest blue, Jack and I sat on the watchtower's edge, legs swinging in rhythm. "Do you think it's over?" he asked. I looked out at the street, at the lanterns the Jeffersons had hung, at the chalk rainbows still untouched by rain, at the basketball hoop leaning ever so slightly to the left. "Not over," I said. "But we're through the worst of it." He nodded, then said, "It's better up here now."
Why?
"Because everyone can see it." And I understood what he meant. The watchtower wasn't just ours anymore. It belonged to the street, to the kids, to the noise and the chalk and the flags, to the people who had learned that being good neighbors didn't mean being quiet. It meant being present, being kind, being brave. The moving truck came on a Tuesday. No one gathered to watch, but everyone noticed. The way people notice when a storm cloud finally drifts off the horizon, relieved, but still cautious. It was early morning when Avery began hauling boxes out onto his driveway, dressed as always in that crisp, button-down shirt that now hung off him like paper. His motions were stiff, mechanical. He barked instructions at the two men loading the truck, but they moved without urgency. There was no farewell, no goodbyes from neighbors, no curious kids waving from porches. Just silence. A slow undoing of a presence that had once loomed over the whole block like a shadow. He didn't look up once. Not at the watchtower, not at the kids playing chalk hopscotch 2 yards away, not at the people who passed by without speaking. He carried his last box, shut the truck door with a final thud, and got in the car alone. Then he was gone. No one clapped. No one cheered. And that felt right, because what we needed now wasn't noise. It was breath. That evening, Jack climbed the watchtower with his notebook in hand. He hadn't brought it up there in weeks. Not since before the restraining order, before the porch lights started to feel like warnings instead of invitations. I watched him from the kitchen window as he sat quietly, scribbling something into a fresh page. When the sun dipped low enough to spill gold across the backyard, I climbed up to join him. He didn't look up right away, just kept drawing. It was a picture of the treehouse, our version, the second one, with tiny stick figures on the ladder, string lights wrapped around the trunk, and a red flag waving at the top. He'd labeled it, Watchtower of Light. I sat beside him, legs hanging off the edge like we used to do in the early days. "Does it feel different now?" I asked. Jack nodded.
Yeah.
"How so?" "It's not just for hiding anymore." That stopped me. He looked at me then, older than 9, older than he had any right to be. "When we first built it, I think I wanted to escape. From everything. But now it feels like it's part of everything." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "You're right," I said. The motion lights kicked on beneath us as a family walked by on the sidewalk, laughing. A little girl pointed at the watchtower and whispered something to her mom. She waved. I waved back. For so long, I thought this story was about what had been taken from us. The treehouse.
The peace.
The childhood I'd tried to protect. I thought every nail we hammered into these boards was a way to reclaim control, to fight back,
To win.
but Jack was right. The watchtower wasn't built for war. It was built for vision. It was a place to look out from, not down on. A place to welcome, not defend. A reminder of what we stood for, not just what we stood against. Walter joined us later, a folding chair creaking beneath him as he settled in. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but his presence was its own kind of punctuation. He passed me a root beer, passed Jack one too. We sat in the glow of dusk, the three of us. Not warriors. Not survivors. Just a grandfather, a father, and a son. Reclaiming peace one breath at a time. Down below, kids ran through sprinklers, their screams light and unburdened. The Jeffersons played music from a speaker hung on their porch, something soft, something jazz. The sky turned lavender, and the air was thick with grilled corn and second chances. I leaned back against the wooden wall of the watchtower and let it hold me. For the first time, in what felt like years, I wasn't thinking about the next move, the next threat, the next legal letter. I was thinking about how the lights in the tree glowed like stars at eye level, about how Jack had drawn the flag bigger than the ladder, about how some victories don't look like triumph, they look like quiet, safe, home. Jack pulled a flashlight from his bag, turned it on, and pointed it toward the backyard like a signal. "Do you think we should write a new sign?" he asked. "What would it say?" He thought for a moment. Then he grinned. "This is where joy lives." We didn't carve it that night. We didn't need to. It was already true. And that was enough. It should have never taken this much, just to feel safe in your own backyard.